Yes, it is working. Okay, great. So once again, I want to welcome everyone to our webinar tonight on NATO, dangerous, obsolete, and aggressive, a report back. We have a great program for you tonight. 3 US peace activists that were over in Madrid last week for the massive demonstrations against the NATO summit. The webinar tonight is co-sponsored by Massachusetts Peace Action and the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our 3 speakers, and then I will call on them one by one. I think I'll introduce each speaker before they speak. That makes more sense. So our first up is going to be Ann Wright. She is a retired U.S. Army colonel and a former U.S. diplomat. She resigned in March 2003 in opposition to the Iraq War. She has devoted herself to anti-war activism ever since, and she is speaking to us from Hawaii. Ann, we have to spotlight Ann. Give me 1 second here. There we go. There's Ann.
Hey.
Hi, Ann. Take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Cole, and it's a pleasure to be with you all. Here it is in the afternoon here in Honolulu, 6 hours behind you all, and it's great to be able to speak with Joseph and Pocky, who are part of the U.S. delegation that went to the No to NATO protests that we had in Madrid, Spain, a week and a half ago. There were about 10 U.S. citizens that were there, including another person from Boston, young Kala Walsh, who is now, I think, in France for the rest of the summer. We also had Joe Lombardo from the United National Anti-War Coalition and several other young people that I had never met before and somehow found out about No to NATO, saying no to the massive military organization that the U.S. is one of the primary instigators for. And if I may, I'd like to show you all some photographs from that weekend that we had there. And let's see if I can get this all together. And there we go. So we have NATO, dangerous, obsolete, and aggressive. I love that. Thank you all for having that as the title of this this webinar, because it is. And I think Joseph will be talking more about NATO in Europe, and I will in a minute get into NATO in another part of the world where the North Atlantic Treaty Organization should not be, which is in the Pacific, for God's sakes. So No to NATO is an international coalition of organizations that are challenging what NATO is doing in the world. And this coalition calls for protests every time the NATO heads of state meet. So I personally have been to No to NATO events in Warsaw, Poland, in Brussels, and of course, Washington, D.C., Chicago, and other places. And we would encourage anyone that's interested to let us know or go to No to NATO and start following this, because it's really interesting to see all of the people internationally that come to the No to NATO protests. And here's the logo of NATO itself, the 30 countries now that make up NATO, plus perhaps 2 more very quickly, Finland and Sweden, who after the Russian incursion into Ukraine have decided that they, after 50 years, 60 years, 70 years since the Cold War, the first Cold War, now they've decided that they want to join NATO. Well, here's the heads of states that were there. Always a real collection, and always a collection of people that demand the highest security. So Madrid, Spain was locked down as this meeting began. And I think they said they had 10,000 extra police on the streets to make sure that nobody came close to these folks. Well, a few people did come close to them, and here are the wives of all of the heads of NATO state, or some of the wives. And interestingly enough, they are standing in front of one of the world famous photographs or paintings about war. And that's the Pablo Picasso painting Guernica, which is in the Reina Sofia Museum. And, you know, here it is, a painting of war. So it was pretty ironic that indeed the wives went to the place that probably these other guys should have been standing in front of, but they weren't the only ones that took advantage of this painting in Madrid, Spain. And there were protests, the protesters that came and did a die-in in front of the war painting of Pablo Picasso, which certainly is a much more realistic symbol of that painting. The people that die in the wars, the people that die in the NATO wars, and the NATO aggressive actions that they do. Now, we had a peace summit. In fact, we had two peace summits in Madrid. The Spanish organized quite a few events for us that the international speakers and a lot of Spanish organizations and Spanish speakers was held. This particular one was held at a labor union facility that was in downtown Madrid, very convenient. And here are some of the peace panels and workshops that we had. Every time we have a no to NATO protest, we have a symposium, panels and workshops, so people can get more up to date on, you know, what the latest thing that NATO has come up with in order to really jeopardize the security of the world rather than making security better. And some of the topics, of course, climate crisis and militarism. Of course, the war on Ukraine and how that all happened with NATO's involvement, really, and for certainly the U.S. involvement in it. Collective security issues. What is a better collective security? New international world orders, resistance to wars, stop killer robots. So there were a lot of topics that were covered during the 2 days of workshops. And it culminated on Sunday in a very big march that went through the street next to the Prado Museum and then into downtown Madrid. You know, it's the first time we've really had, that I've been a part of, a really big march. And I would say that we're at least 15,000. Of course, you know, we would have loved to have had 100,000, but the 15,000, considering that COVID is still going on and around, was pretty darn good. And there were people from all over Europe that were there, from Belgium, from Germany, from Finland, from France, from Greece, from, well, lots of places. And here's some of the banners that they had: no to the NATO bases. How about some schools and hospitals instead of the wars that NATO have been a part of? And here we are, myself and Paki Whalen, who will be talking in a few minutes. We were part of this. I mentioned before that NATO has gone into different areas. And in fact, when the NATO leaders issued their summit statement, they talked about the Pacific. As I mentioned earlier, NATO is called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and yet now they are wanting and already in the Pacific area. And in fact, here I am in Honolulu, Hawaii, which is the headquarters of the Indo-Pacific Military Command for the U.S. military. And we've already had start here in Honolulu, starting on June 29th, is called Rim of the Pacific Naval War Maneuvers, or RIMPAC. RIMPAC, it's held every 2 years, and you can see from this photograph the huge array of military equipment that is used in these RIMPAC maneuvers. This RIMPAC is the largest naval exercise in the world, and NATO is participating in it. There are 26 countries that are a part of this, 25,000 military personnel, 38 ships, 4 submarines, 170 aircraft, and 9 nations that will be doing ground maneuvers from amphibious vehicles that will be bringing them from ships to grind to shore on the coral reefs and into the sands of beaches here in Hawaii. Now, and some of the things they do in this RIMPAC naval exercise is shoot lots of missiles. They torpedo ships, practice sinking ships. I mean, this is war practice for sure. They sink them too. The U.S. has several ships that are held over the decades just for target practice. And in the Pacific, we now are littered. The seafloor is littered with the remains of these target practice. And here are some of the military that are going to be going ashore from these amphibious boats. And what happens? Well, not only is coral torn up and whales and dolphins are injured, these dolphins actually are from the Black Sea, and that's from the increase in the number of marine mammals that have died due to this conflict between Russia and Ukraine, which is also taking place not only on land, but also in the sea. And these are some of the dolphins that have washed up on the Black Sea shores. Now in RIMPAC, it's a test bed for all sorts of things. And this is a test this year of major big ships that are robots, that are unmanned ships that are now coming across the Pacific. They've left San Diego and they've traveled without any human being on board and arrived here in Honolulu to be a part of this RIMPAC operation. You know, the wave of the future. Not only do we have robots in the sky, the unmanned aerial vehicles, the assassin drones, but now we have assassin ships that have no humans on board, but have plenty of armory, plenty of weapons that can do the bidding of somebody on shore to attack enemy ships. Here's one of the ominous ships. This is one of the new Zumwalt class destroyers that has come into Honolulu. This is, it looks like something out of Star Wars. It really does. It's a eerie ship. NATO is participating in these RIMPAC exercises. And in fact, 8 NATO countries have sent their ships. Canada, Colombia. Oh, Colombia. That's North Atlantic. It does have access on the Atlantic, but Colombia is the first of the Latin American countries that are now a part of NATO. Denmark, France, Germany, the Netherlands, the UK, the United States, all NATO members. And then added to that are 4 NATO partners in Asia and the Pacific, and those are Australia, Japan, South Korea, and New Zealand. And then you can read the remainder of the 26 countries to include India, Israel, that are participating in these military exercises, military war exercises, military war maneuvers. So 45% of the countries that are participating in RIM of the Pacific are members or partners of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, how do you challenge these sorts of things? Well, now in Honolulu, we have set up a 10-day encampment in front of the Pacific Fleet headquarters, the headquarters where all of the war plans for the Navy are put together. And in fact, it's the Pacific Fleet headquarters that is organized this 2022 Rim of the Pacific military exercises. So every day for 10 days, we've been having an encampment with programs, with plenty of signage, so that everybody that has to drive up to the headquarters of the Pacific Fleet Command has to go by this encampment, which is saying we don't like what you're doing on RIMPAC, and we also don't like what you've done to the water supply of Honolulu. as around most military bases, there's plenty of pollution. And here in Hawaii, the Navy polluted the drinking water for 93,000 people just 6 months ago. So we are still on the protest of that and trying to close down the 20 massive 20-story high tanks that were built 80 years ago into one of the hills up from Pearl Harbor Naval Base. Each day we have programming. Tomorrow is going to be a big day for us in the Hawaii Peace and Justice area. We're going to be talking about militarization in Hawaii, and we'll be moving it out throughout the whole Pacific, of course, but tomorrow is the day for the discussion about the militarization, huge militarization that has gone on here in the Hawaiian Islands. This is a scene from the encampment looking back to the west. And if you look right along the edge of the lower part of the picture, you can see an aircraft carrier. This is an aircraft carrier that's not more than 150 yards from where our encampment is. It's the USS Abraham Lincoln that has 5,000 people on board. And then next to it are the big towers of the largest ship that the South Korean military has. It's an amphibious assault ship. And those are ironically sitting right within perfect view of our encampment. So our cancel RIMPAC signs that we have out on the back of the tents are there as the military folks that are on these ships walk down the highway and out to wherever they're going. They have to see all of the things that we put up that are challenging these military operations. And here's another view of aircraft carriers and other ships that are in Pearl Harbor. 38 ships from other countries are in Pearl Harbor right now and will be departing on July 11th. We also are having sign waving and demonstrations out on all the roads. And here's some of the folks with the cancel RIMPAC and demilitarize and other statements. So yeah, did you see that one? There are a lot of youth are putting up their signs that some of the older folks of ours are going, oh, you shouldn't be saying that word. And they're going, are you kidding? What they're doing? We can at least say that. So here we are right here on the shores saying no to RIMPAC, no to NATO in the Pacific. And we're joined by people from other parts of the Pacific. This picture is taken in Jeju Island, South Korea, at the naval base that was built over the strenuous objections of people of Jeju Island, which is called an island of peace, except the South Koreans and the US built a massive naval base on that beautiful island. And it was from this naval base that the 4 South Korean ships left to go to the United States for RIMPAC. So what do we say? Well, we say cancel RIMPAC, and we want a world without RIMPAC. And if you look at the logo on the right, where we have taken out all of the military equipment from the logo, which was the original logo of the military, but we adapted it and put in whales and turtles and other things, birds that should be in there, not these ships. So that's a little update for kind of giving you a view of what happened in Madrid and what's happening out here in the Pacific as we say no to NATO in the Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. We are so happy to hear what's going on, the organizing in Hawaii and the Pacific area. This is very impressive work. Let me see. Next up is going to be Joseph Gerson. He is president of the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security. He is vice president of the International Peace Bureau. He's a member of Mass Peace Action's board of directors and of its nuclear disarmament working group, and he lives in Watertown, Massachusetts. Joseph.
So thank you, Cole. It's always wonderful to kind of follow Anne with her remarkable energy and commitments. She made reference to COVID kind of rolling through Madrid, and I have to say I'm on the upside of having caught that wave. So this is not going to be my most dynamic talk, but I hope it will be sufficiently informative. As Anne said, I mean, the conferences and the demonstrations in Madrid were quite remarkable. It'd be wonderful if we had that kind of energy in our peace movement today. I mean, it was easily 10,000, maybe 15,000 people in the demonstration on Sunday, the 27th. Just to say, for me, Madrid was at the end of a 3-week-long odyssey, which interestingly began in Mongolia. And just to kind of help people understand different ways of viewing the world, I was there for a 30th anniversary meeting to celebrate and to reinforce Mongolia's single nation nuclear weapons free zone. And in addition, and it was interesting people there. I mean, it was much of the elite, including a former president who pushed for it in the beginning. And their commitment there is not only to advancing nuclear disarmament, but for them, the nuclear weapons free zone is also a way that they maintain their independence from both China and Russia. And given Mongolia's history, we need to appreciate the roles of history in the world. The Mongolians tend to look at Russia as the balancer against China. So a complex world that we live in. Just to say that, after the Paris Peace Accords, way back when we thought that it ended the Vietnam War, I accepted an invitation to work with the War Sisters International in London and later in Brussels. And I began then to intimate that NATO had a role that was not simply defensive. I began to intuit its imperial role, but frankly, back then I didn't have the chops to do the analysis. But over time, I have, beginning with opposition to the Afghan war, NATO's Afghan war, and joining with people across Europe in opposing it, and what became the beginning of the No to War, No to NATO network that I've been associated with since its founding. Simply to say that if you look at the history, you'll find that NATO's first Secretary General explained, actually an English lord, explained that the purpose of NATO was to keep Russia out, Germany down, and the United States in. And it's that latter part that I think we really need to focus on. Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote a really quite remarkable primer on how to maintain the US empire, the grand chessboard. And in it, what he said is that going back to old-fashioned geopolitics, whoever controls Eurasia is the world's dominant power. And that the United States, like Britain as an island power, it had to create toeholds on Eurasia. In the West, it's NATO. In the South, it was long our control in the Middle East and more recently in Afghanistan. And in the East, it's our bases and the use of the Pacific as an American lake, as Anne was talking about. And so what we have is kind of a commitment to NATO's role in reinforcing the US empire and imperial system. Just to say that what was really most significant about this summit was in a sense, stepping back from where they thought they were going to go. The initial thought was that Russia was going to be downplayed as a priority, and China made the major priority for NATO. In the event, they needed to, given the war, they opted to make Russia still the primary focus of NATO, while for the first time in NATO's history and the history of NATO summits, identified China as a systemic threat to Western values, to the so-called rules-based order. And as Anne was saying, we now have, and even before this, we had deep involvement of NATO countries, especially in the efforts to control the sea, with European navies joining those of the United States. In terms of some of the evolution, well, the other pieces, I'm sorry, the other main pieces in terms of significance here, so a commitment to a massive military buildup by NATO, and deployment of more forces to the Baltics and to Eastern Europe. I'll come back to that in a little bit. We'll say a bit more about that. Just to say that in terms of this U.S. toehold in Eurasia, the United States has about 100,000 troops permanently based there, with hundreds of bases. Between being in Mongolia and in Vienna for the TPNW first meeting, I went to a peace encampment outside the Ramstein Air Base. It's a massive, massive base. From Ramstein, the U.S. has basically fought its drone wars. The Africa Command has been there. It's the central base for resupply or supplying the Ukraine military now. And interestingly, as in the case of, say, Japan or South Korea, or just a host of Philippines, host of other countries, what the Germans in the area experience is that their country is occupied by a foreign military force, and many of them are working for its withdrawal. In terms of some of the evolution, it's important to understand, again, as Anne was intimating, that NATO is not simply a North Atlantic alliance. Especially since 2010, it's become a global alliance. There's a question before. Colombia is a partner of NATO, as is the Philippines, as is Japan, as is South Korea. And interestingly, and reflecting the changes that Anne was intimating, both the prime ministers of Japan and South Korea came to the NATO summit for the first time. And Prime Minister Kishida has since talked about the priority that Japan is going to give to increasing its military collaborations with NATO. Just to appreciate that Japan is already the #6 biggest military spender in the world, and the Chinese have deep concerns about its Navy. Let me say a few things about what I picked up from the European left when I was in Madrid and elsewhere. Certainly there's some divisions over the war in Ukraine, but there's unanimity that NATO's expansion was a provocation and led to a sense of strategic vulnerability to which the Russians were responding. There's a clear unity in opposing the deployment of any NATO troops to Ukraine, and there's unity for the need for a ceasefire and a negotiated settlement. There are deep concerns across Europe about the coming winter, about how cold it's going to be, about the lack of heating fuel, and what that's going to mean. An expectation that this is going to lead to protests in Europe and open the way for extreme right-wing forces to increase their influence and power. Among a number of Germans that I met with, there's a sense that there's an appreciation of the ties between Germany and Russia, even as we may disdain Putin, and many of them disdain Putin, but importance in terms of their economic ties and the energy supplies that have now been coming to Germany for decades. One person said, Germany's great economy has not been a function of its expertise, but rather it's being fueled by cheap energy sources. Before the Supreme Court decisions, and then with them, especially around abortions and guns, I think there's really even a growing sense that Americans are barbarians at the gate. That our country is what I think many of us are seeing now. It's in a disastrous situation. For Europeans, and especially the Spanish, there was a sense of horror and outrage at the deaths being caused by European and NATO military forces as they keep migrants out of Europe, those trying to cross the Mediterranean. And just before the summit, there was the mass death at the Melilla Spanish enclave as migrants were trying to get in, and a sense of really horror what those NATO forces and European forces are doing. There's a critique of military spending. Even before the increases mandated at the summit, NATO accounted for more than half of the world's military spending. And just to note that in the context of the Ukraine war, many of you will be aware that Germany has committed to spend an extra 100 billion euros to increase its military power and deployments. That will make Germany the third biggest military spender in the world. We have to understand that we're moving back. It's kind of backwards into history. Was it back into the future in terms of facing possibilities of German military power and what that means? Finally, just in terms of some of this left analysis, there are divisions over the relationship between the European military, an effort to build an independent European military, maybe an independent European military superpower, and its relationship to NATO. So you have is, on the one hand, a sense that there might be a division of labor between this independent European military and NATO, or on the other hand, especially with the history of Trump and the uncertainties about what's going to happen in 2024, the possibility that a European military might move to, if you will, usurp the role that NATO has played. Let me then move to the summit itself. First of all, NATO is presenting itself as more unified than ever, and in many ways it is. But at the same time, there are pretty deep fault lines. On the one hand, you have the Baltic states and the Eastern European nations increasingly aggressive, wanting, as you know, wanting Putin's defeat, complete defeat in the war in Ukraine. And on the other hand, what are more the core nations of the European Union, France, Germany, and Italy, who are more willing to make accommodations. The Madrid summit was billed as making what they called transformative decisions. And even before the summit itself, I mean, to understand the summit is sort of a, we'll call it, it's a decorative event. The decisions have already been made before the heads of state arrive. And interestingly, most of them were posted on NATO's website. So let me run through what those major decisions are. They've adopted a new strategic concept. And if I don't screw up here, let me put the URL for that strategic concept in the chat. So you can now take a look at the strategic concept. As I said before, it identifies Russia as the most significant and direct threat, but addresses China for the first time. They say that they're strengthening the alliance for we may call a new Cold War, or what some are describing as a new ice age. I mean, we're moving into a very deep freeze, very dangerous time in relations. We have the upgraded defense plans. We have more U.S. troops going to the Baltic states, to Poland, to Romania, and more to Germany. They are increasing their they call it their battle groups, the NATO battle group, from 40,000 to 300,000. So to understand the massive transformation that this involves. And though they don't broadcast it, they reaffirmed NATO as a nuclear alliance. And we should be aware that the United States is now in the process of pre-positioning nuclear weapons, B-6112s, to six NATO countries in Europe. Another point, they call it investing more in defense. So all of the NATO countries have committed or recommitted to spend at least 2% of their gross domestic product on military by 2024. Obviously, Ukraine was a major source of discussion there. And so they strengthened and reinforced, increased what they call the comprehensive assistance package for Ukraine, more military equipment. But particularly important, I think, and little noted, was, as they say, deepening integration of Ukraine deepening Ukraine's integration into NATO, sending more NATO weapon systems, building greater interoperability between Ukrainian and NATO forces. And they also are providing more weapons and support for Bosnia and Herzegovina, Georgia, and Moldova. They have their soft power dimension, in which they commit to reducing NATO's greenhouse gas emissions. We all know that if you cut military spending and cut the military's emissions of climate change, we'd be in great shape. They also commit to deepening integration and cooperation for developing new high-tech weapon systems. Australia, Japan, New Zealand, Republic of Korea were there for the first time and resolved to deepen cooperation. Now, interestingly, the question of new members. So we know that Finland and Sweden have now been formally invited to become NATO members. And that doubles the size of NATO's border with Russia. But little noted was that the summit doubled down on Ukrainian and Georgian possible membership. They reaffirmed the commitment to NATO's so-called open door for aspiring members. So check that out in the strategic concept that's there. And finally, not quite finally, but almost there. You have the focus on the global South, anti-terrorism, what I would describe as neocolonialism, and competition for influence with China in the global South. So there's the recommitment to fight terrorism, what they call NATO's 360-degree approach to deterrence and defense, and challenging China's influence along the alliance's southern neighborhood. Finally, in terms of the strategic doctrine, they have recommitted their commitments to collective defense. Where's George Orwell when we need him? So all of the language basically talks about, as it says, the equally strong commitment to the rules-based international order and allies' shared values of individual liberty, human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. So let's think in terms of Turkey. Let's think in terms of Hungary. Let's think in terms of Poland, the partnership with with Marcos and the dictatorships in the Philippines. So I think we need to understand that we're basically dealing with traditional great power imperial forces here. Which way forward? It's easy to be a critic. I think we need to help people if we're going to move toward the kind of common security order that we need, toward addressing essential human needs here in the United States, reducing war, reducing the threat of war, reducing the moving toward negotiation of the war in Ukraine. We need to be helping people understand what NATO really is. We need to be pressing, as Cole will be talking later, in terms of cutting our military spending. And we need, I think, to reconceive what the United States is and what our role in the world is. And I think that's an essential, without vision, there's really no alternative policies or direction. I think we need to be identifying how we develop, and we have to struggle for it here, a democratic nation which lives with respect for other nations, even as we differ with them. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph, for that extremely informative and sobering presentation. We're up against a huge One second.
Oh, I'm the one who's supposed to be coughing, not you.
Well, we're glad to see that you're getting better, Joseph. We need you around as much as possible. I guess while Cole gets himself a glass of water, I will put in the chat again the action, and I just encourage everybody to take it. The action proposes increases in military spending, which we know is tied very closely to NATO expansion, as Joseph just said about the rearmament of Germany. So I'll hand it back to you, Cole, but just a reminder to everyone to please take action, send a message to your members of Congress opposing increases in military spending. It's incredibly easy and quick. That's my pitch.
Thank you, Brian, for doing that action. We have 230 people on the call tonight. We should get at least 150 people taking action, sending a message to decision makers. This is important. As you may know, the National Defense Authorization Act will be on the floor of the House, maybe next week, but definitely by the following week. So these votes are imminent, and there's a variety of amendments on important aspects, including cutting the overall dollar figure. Next up is going to be Paki Whelan. She is active with Code Pink for many years, and she is also Congressional District 2 captain for Massachusetts Peace Action, and she comes to us from Greenfield, Massachusetts. Paki.
And so here I am in Greenfield, and thank you. I'd love to just take off where Joseph was leading us. So what are we going to do? You know, I went back to what was NATO in the beginning, and remember that Warsaw Pact and NATO's fundamental goal to safeguard the Allies' freedom and security by political and military means. So there it was, this very lofty thing, the Allies' freedom. This was post-Second World War, when there was such fear that the Warsaw Pact, that the Soviet Union was going to keep going west. And so what's happened, though, is, so here was that, we could call that the sheep's clothing. And what NATO has become is the wolf in the sheep's clothing. And I was just reading something today, B.J. Pritchard's latest piece, where he refers to the NATO as the Trojan horse of the US positioning itself as the world's policeman. And I think when I listened to Anne and to Joseph, this is exactly what's happening. NATO, NATO, North Atlantic. No, it's beyond that. And as you noted, both of you, the increase in military spending in these NATO countries, and one of the things that we certainly got out of the conference in Madrid was the toll that's taking, just as it does here in the United States, that social services are cut back, healthcare, education, a number of things that we feel in this country. And I would often find myself saying, why can't we be like Europe? Why can't we have universal health care? And what was happening in Spain, we heard, is that it's becoming more like us. And that's in direct relation to where the budgets are being spent, where the funds of the countries are being spent. So what I'd like to do is, we've got all this information, and if you all deciphered what both Anne, who talked, I loved what you had to say both about NATO in Europe and the conference, and the resistance of Europeans, but also what NATO is doing in the Pacific. This wolf in sheep's clothing is there too, to keep us all safe. I read and we heard so much about this wonderful love of democracy, and how one of the partners, who's not a member of NATO to be sure, but it's certainly a beneficiary, is Saudi Arabia. So the tentacles are just everywhere. And the question I have for you, for us who are sitting here in this webinar tonight, is what are we going to do about it? Because that's what the information is good. The information is really important to know what we're talking about. But what are we going to do? Because that's what really matters. And it is important. I think, what did you say? We have 230 people at this webinar, and we want 150 people signing those petitions. Come on, we want 229, and that 30th person is just getting that.
I stand corrected.
So here we have a couple of things that are really natural. Many of us, I certainly, came of age during the Cold War, and so we learned that the Russians were bad, and that we were the good guys, and that NATO was going to be a protector, and that if there was going to be a war, it was going to be with Russia, and so we had to have all these safeguards. Well, Fortunately, most of us, or many of us, and I'm sure many of us sitting in this room tonight, learned otherwise, that it wasn't the Russians who were the enemy, and grew beyond that. So what we have, though, is this runaway wolf in sheep's clothing, and what are we going to do about it? So we sign petitions, we lobby our legislators, and we often find ourselves again and again saying, "Oh my God, we're speaking to the choir," and I believe we need to have choir practice often. So it's not bad to speak to the choir, but how do we go beyond ourselves and the peace movement that we were talking about the peace treaty, the anti-nuclear war treaty, the abolition of nuclear war, they're a perfect partner for us who want to defund NATO, because one of the big pieces of NATO is bringing nuclear weapons to the NATO countries. So that's a likely partner for us, as is everybody in every environmental movement that we know of. Because again, what does the military do? And both Joseph and refer to the power of the military to destroy the environment. I mean, as I listened to Anne talk about the destruction of boats that sink into the Pacific, and just read somewhere the other day someone talking about the Pacific Ocean. When the Pacific Ocean dies, life on Earth is dead. And those are contributors to that death of the ocean. So what I would like to do now is invite you who have been listening, getting all this good information, to join in this conversation, to suggest some ideas that you have for, first of all, informing people. And I'll just go back to one thing. When I told my peace community that I was going to go to Madrid to say no to NATO, a number of people said to me, "Well, wait, I'm not sure we want to do this." And I was actually, because I am quintessentially naive, I was surprised to hear that from people. But I think that's part of the ingrained and the air we breathe from childhood, from early memories, that NATO was good, and so it was. I was surprised, but anyway. So part of what our task is to demythologize NATO. That first of all, it had all these lofty things. I saw pictures of Dwight Eisenhower being the salesman for NATO. He went to all these European countries, and of course, he was the prince and the savior of the Second World War. So he had a lot of credibility and really moved that whole narrative of creating NATO. And the thing that struck me, and I wonder about your thinking on this, is that it was set up to counter the Warsaw Pact, and the Warsaw Pact certainly dissolved and was well gone by 1991. But so why didn't NATO just dissolve too? Well, for the same reasons that so much has happened here in the United States, right? We ended the war. So where was the peace dividend? Well, there isn't a peace dividend when you've got military installations. You have military contractors in every congressional district. So where's the peace dividend? So we're still working on that. And because we're here, we're still committed. So I will now turn this to you to say, what are some of your ideas about how we educate people that NATO is not good for us? It's not good for the people of the United States. It's not good for the people of North America or the North Atlantic, or the rest of the world where it's got its tentacles. And we noted that it's also connected to Africa, South America, and of course, as Anne so brilliantly elucidated, it's all over the Pacific. So what are we going to do? And I would love to hear from you ideas about how you've reached out to our community, our peace community, and beyond to take action. So if we have Joan Stoller's raised hand.
So I'm on.
Okay, Joan, go ahead.
Okay, great. In terms of educating the American public, I don't know if this would work, follow to Europe or not, but I think it can be very exciting for people who don't really understand an issue like NATO, and I barely do. If we had a series, at least one, but I prefer a series of debates. And I was thinking the unions and maybe Georgetown University or American University or something that could sponsor so that there'd be an audience with feedback and questions and a really strong educated monitor or mediator and two people on each side. And maybe they wouldn't be so far to the left or so far to the right, but that or maybe there would be three so that there'd be somebody in the middle debating, but there would be plenty of time for them to state their positions, the cons, they could debate against one another, the moderator could interview them individually. And I like the structure of the Doha debates. You can Google those on YouTube. But I always find a debate very exciting. And I tend to get involved with presentations. And I like the idea that if we had some really good marketing or PR people anyway, who could promote it so that there would be a nationwide excitement about, who was going to speak for who and that maybe there could be some activity or some, I don't know, Fox News, for instance, stirs up in a lot of people a thrill of watching because they're angry and they're fighting and they're speaking names. And that's not what I'm after, but that whole idea of the passion behind a debate and arguing your side, who's going to support your side, I think could be really useful in spreading the idea of, that there are two sides of this question, two strong sides of the question, and a good middle mediating. Anyway, I would like to toss that idea around with people who think maybe it would work, or at least something to try that we haven't done.
I think this is a.
Thank you, John. Let me come in, Paki. We have, in response to Paki's invitation, a number of people raising their hand, which is great. Why don't I call on 2 or 3 comments from the attendees, and then we'll ask the panel to respond to a number of comments, if that's all right. Let's go to Alice Slater next.
Hi, I think we have to go beyond just NATO. The reason we can't get to people is because nobody's getting the truth in our media. And the media is connected to what Eisenhower warned about, the military-industrial complex, and which Ray McGovern, who formed Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, VIPs, he was a CIA briefer for Bush and Clinton, very distinguished. He calls it the Mickey Map, the Military Industrial Congressional Intelligence Media Academic Think Tank Conference. And I just wrote a piece in the IDN newsletter. I mean, I was quoted in it, but Noam Chomsky, the famous linguist, said that he Googled the word unprovoked, the way they've been talking about Russia, the unprovoked invasion of Ukraine with no context of that we had promised Gorbachev we wouldn't expand NATO beyond East Germany, and this so many reasons why Russia was upset about Ukraine before they attacked. And he said it was over like 1,200,000 times that they said the unprovoked attack, Putin's unprovoked attack. And then he Googled unprovoked attack in Iraq, and there were about 8,000 citations in left-wing journals. So we have a big problem with this Mickey Man. And somehow I think we have to put our brains together and figure out how we can do like what Occupy Wall Street did. Like they talked about the 1% and the 9%, everybody got it. We need like a meme, I don't know what it is, that we can all use and wake people up to understand that they have to look behind the reporting that they're getting. And the other thing is we're a nation of laws. NATO is lawless. I mean, we signed a treaty with the United Nations. When I was a child, we sang songs to the United Nations, love songs to the United Nations. And Clinton, the Democrat, the Republican, was the first one that violated our treaty by bombing Kosovo against the Security Council veto of Russia. Because in our treaty with the UN, we said we would never commit any war of aggression unless we were under imminent threat of attack without the UN Security Council approval. And Clinton said, screw it. Responsibility to protect, so they bombed the crap out of the country to protect them. You know, I mean, I know I'm going on, but I think we have to think in terms of how we get people to understand they're not getting the whole story from the media. And some kind of real respectful law, because this rules-based order means whoever has the guns and the power makes the law. That's what they're doing right now. They're creating a whole new international apparatus when we have the United Nations that we have signed a treaty with.
Great, thanks, Alice. Let me call on one more, and then I'll go to the panel. Teresa Elamine, please unmute.
Thank you so much, Cole. This is amazing. I love Anne Wright, and now I know about Joseph, and glad to know Packy. The Women's International League for Peace and Freedom has a No to NATO subcommittee of its Disarm in Wars Committee, and Packy is on that committee. We meet tomorrow at noon to work on a 30-month strategy for getting members in the over 30 branches of WILF around the country educated on the WILF position, which is internationally known for decades of being no to NATO, to answer Packy's question on what we're doing about. I was a union organizer, so my specialty is strategic campaign planning. So I say we have to build a massive movement to put 1 million people in the streets like we were able to do around the Vietnam era. That's what we have to do, Joan Stallard. We have to do bottom-up organizing as a mass movement, not getting experts debating each other, but put the people in the street and start to put some color in the anti-war movement so that it's not so overwhelmingly white. We've got to engage with Black, Indigenous people of color who are always fighting for our liberation. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. Let me go to the panel. Who wants to take some of those tempting ideas first?
Yeah, I'll start. Well, I agree with Teresa. Yeah, whatever all of our organizations can do to reach out to groups, organizations, ethnic groups, whatever, that have not really been a part of the major peace movements. We certainly need to work with them to help offer an understanding of what we think of and listen to them about how this impacts on their lives. I think the main thing is listening to other people about what what they think, and that gives us a step into their world that they may say, well, what you're working on is pretty interesting for us too. So I like that too. I also like Joan's idea also. I think it is, the more we can get another group of people that hasn't been really active, and that being college kids. If we can have some presentations, debates at universities, and get political science teachers interested in doing things on the good, the bad, and the ugly of old NATO, can't help but educate our younger generation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ann. Joseph?
I'll jump in here. A couple of points. First of all, I think we need to move beyond anything like single issue. And I think we have to recognize that the most basic democratic rights in this country and culture are under assault. We may not have something like constitutional democracy in a few years. So I think we need to speak to the Supreme Court coup that we've just had, work to protect elections, even if we have serious problems with a number of the Democrats. And we need to make common cause with a whole range of issues and concerns. Inflation is hitting. We need to be talking about the need to spend less on weapons, less for NATO, and more for the basic human survival that people need here. And I think that means, among other things, really preparing for what's going to be a hard winter here too. Two other points just to make. I think there was a question related to kind of the immediate post-Cold War period and agreements that were made there. Again, we are so ignorant of our history. So to appreciate that beginning in 1990 with the Paris Charter, you had a series of common security agreements in which the United States, NATO countries, and Russia agreed not to move to, not to attempt to improve their security at the expense of others. And then, as Packy was saying, Clinton moved, or I guess it was not Packy, but Alice, Clinton moved to smash those commitments with the expansion. The last thing to say, just in terms of some vision and something, it's not going to move a mass movement, but I think a number of us can be pressing on it in our op-eds and in our meetings with congressional staff and so on, is out of Europe, there are calls for a new Helsinki process. That was the détente process and the common security process that preceded and then followed the end of the Cold War. That was where the security architecture of Europe was associated. With Finland joining NATO, we can't have a new Helsinki process, but we can have a Dublin or a Vienna process. And I think we need to, even if we're in the middle of war, even if it's not on people's agenda at the moment, to begin talking about the need for negotiation of a strategic nuclear disarmed architecture, not only in Europe, but of course, we have to proceed in pressing for common security negotiations with China, because that's where the really big fight is going to be for the coming decades.
Great. Packy, did you want a word?
Sure. Yeah, just say a couple of things. I think we have two perfect allies. One is the folks who are working on the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, because the invitation of moving into becoming a NATO country invites nuclear weapons, and that's a whole other issue. I think I really appreciate what everybody's been saying, because we need all of the above and more. That I think connecting particularly with the nuclear prohibition people and the environmentalists. I know we at Code Pink have done a lot with looking at what the military does to the environment, how it is one of the worst, it is the worst factor in the degradation of the environment. And so to connect that to not only is it the United States and our Pentagon that does that, but by extension, all of NATO. So to oppose what militarism is doing to the environment is to oppose NATO. And so, yeah, I'd be happy to hear a couple of other people, and let's do all of these and any more ideas.
Great, thank you. Okay, this has been a very rich discussion before. Let's take at least one more round if our panelists are willing to stay another 15 minutes or so. Let me go to Mike Caggiano. Could you unmute?
Okay. Yeah, Joseph was giving me what I thought was pretty bad. Pretty good idea. I see NATO within its ranks, like the Greeks and the Turks have historically been at enmity with one another. And NATO seems to have sat on those guys. I mean, you got 2 NATO members. Suppose like everybody says, we all want to be in NATO. Every African country, China, Russia, everybody, hey, we're all in NATO now. Let's figure out how we're going to keep ourselves from killing each other. And even our own military says the climate is the biggest conflict multiplier on the planet, affects every single NATO member and non-NATO member, and stick it right in their lap and say, hey, NATO, what do you do about the climate? How are we going to get our emissions down? And what the hell are we going to do? I mean, it's just interesting. The UN has been kind of proven to be kind of a defective mechanism, especially when one Security Council poobah, allowed to put the kibosh on every single thing that goes along. Obviously, it needs a new architecture. And I'm thinking maybe drop this hot potato in NATO's lap. Say, NATO, you got it all, baby. Do something with it. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. And now let me go to Tamara Lawrence. Please unmute.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tamara Lawrence. I'm with the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom Canada. I wanted to let you know what we're doing in Canada. So we are challenging the dominant discourse in this country that says, NATO is a respectable organization. It's good that Canada is a part of it. So this is what we hear in mainstream media, and this is also what we hear at our universities. And there are many peace groups that have converged to take a very hard position, a very firm position, Canada out of NATO. So we've been working together on protests and rallies, over the past 3 years. And during this past NATO summit, so last week, there were 15 rallies on the streets from British Columbia to Nova Scotia. And our message was, stop the weapons, stop the war, stop NATO. And we also feel that that we need to engage in some disruption to try to get our message out there, because we aren't given space at the universities. I'm a PhD student as well, and at my university and many universities in the UK and in the US, Zelensky spoke and called on students to support more weapons to Ukraine. But I went to my university when Zelensky spoke at my university with a sign that said, stop sending weapons, stop NATO, stop the war, peace in Ukraine, peace with Russia. And it got into the media. And I raise this with you because I think we need to have more courage to do some disruption, because we need to we need to mobilize quickly. We're running out of time in terms of the climate crisis, and the poverty crisis is getting worse. So I really think that we need to have more courage to get out there and take action. The final point that I want to make is in Madrid, NATO had a 2-day public forum. You can watch the 12 hours online, but there Anthony Blinken speaks. I encourage you to watch what he says if you haven't, and also what Nancy Pelosi says. And then there's a panel with Tom Tillis and with Jean Sheehan. So there's, very strong bipartisan support for NATO. Of course, all the Americans know this, but this is going to be a really tough nut to crack. I encourage you to hear what they have to say, and then some of the questions in the audience, and I'll put a link into the chat. So we're with you in Canada. We need to abolish the alliance, and we need to work together across borders. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Tamara. Let's go to Phil Nichols. Please unmute. Go ahead, Phil. You got to unmute though.
There we go. I got a very pessimistic take on this. I think that until conditions get so bad in America, in terms of economics and mainly economics, that people are so divided, we're like sheep. We get caught up in culture issues and propaganda about we got to stop Russia and all that. And until things get really, really bad, I don't think people are going to be able to listen or hear the kind of message that we're the choir. We see all this, but I don't think many Americans are willing to look at it. I think what Teresa El-Amin said about the rising up in the Vietnam era, that was the era of the draft. And when it was possible to take young men like me and send them over to get maimed and killed, people rose up and said no. That gave a powerful skin in the game motivation. I think until our economy gets really bad, I just don't think people are going to wake up to that. But when they do, the kind of information that we're all spreading, people will then hopefully be willing to listen.
Thanks. And let me just remind everyone to take the action. We have only 67 submissions out of about 200 people that are here. So about 1/3 of the people on tonight's call have taken the action. So I'm calling on the other 2/3 now to fill in that blank and send a message to your senators and representatives, not to increase the military budget, but in fact to decrease it. Okay, so Anne had to head back to her encampment, I believe. So we have Joseph and Pocky to respond to those comments. Go ahead.
Aki, you want to go first?
Yes, go ahead.
Sure. I think this is the thing to do. It's to remind people of the urgency of this. As you were just saying, when your life was threatened, there it was. People took action, and we don't realize because we have that. What is it? That Mickey Matty, and we're up against a lot, but we have more power than we know. We know that, right? So I think making these connections, and I've talked about the environmentalists and the anti-nuclear bomb people, but also everyone who's been connected to the Poor People's Campaign, and particularly all the issues of poverty, that wars impoverish us more than anything else. And it's not just the killing of one person, but look what's happening to all the food sources. There are just so many things. So I want to encourage people whose hands are up to keep this brainstorm going. We know how bad things are, and what the hell are we going to do about it?
So I'll jump in here. I'm a little bit frustrated. I was just trying to move quickly to get a link, which I couldn't do quickly enough. I guess one of my questions is, if we're the frogs in the pot, how hot does the water have to get before we jump out? Our economy is already something of a disaster. We're heading into a recession at the same time that we have inflation. People are hurting. I think food prices last month were up 17%. And, we have great insecurity. Going back to what I said before, look, I don't want to say I'm a student of Weimar Germany, but, Germany had a democracy and it lost a democracy. And we are in very serious danger of losing ours. So I think it's incumbent on everybody in the peace movement to be finding ways to be making common cause, to be engaging with what are the dominant issues in our society and for our future. Two more things just to say. One, just to appreciate Tamara and not only her intervention there, but the work that she's doing. She's dogged in this, and I really appreciate that and enjoyed working with her. What I was looking for and couldn't get quickly enough was an announcement of a conference on July the 30th in New York, which will also be online. It's an international conference organized by the Peace and Planet Network. It's going to include speakers, including from the Poor People's Campaign, but also from Russia, from China, from Ukraine, from Europe, from the Philippines. And it'll be a chance for us to be talking about the really the global crises that we're in and looking at strategies that we can develop. My hope is that I can ask Cole to sending out the link to this to this recording to also send out a notice of the conference.
Can do.
It'll be in person in New York on the 30th and online as well.
Thank you. Well, I think we can do one more round if the panelists are up for it. People are still coming into raising their hand, and we still have good attendance, and people are still taking the action. So let's go ahead to Bruce Burdick. Please unmute. Bruce?
Unmute.
Yeah.
There, now I'm unmuted. So I wish to echo the climate crisis, but it seems the Paris Agreement has really made it an international issue, the climate crisis. And if we could focus on what the individual has to do to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, I think that helps defund NATO. Because if you actually calculate out the CO2 emissions of this ideal world citizen on track to limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees, he can't emit any CO2 or any greenhouse gases by about 2030. So if you can't emit any greenhouse gases, how do NATO soldiers do their job? They can't. So, you know, the United States, a lot of people are watching the January 6th committee. We could also work to have a special committee on complying with the Paris Agreement. And how does NATO comply with the Paris Agreement and limit global warming to 1.5 degrees? We could even have NATO people testify and obviously say, we have no idea how to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, unless they make up this really poor answer of biomass, which does not do it. So that would be my suggestion.
Thank you, Bruce. Let me call on Kim Koo.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate you calling me. I just thought that I would just very briefly state that I feel that we should realize by this point the deep existential crisis of capitalism and imperialism in the US. I mean, this is really existential for them in the sense that they no longer hide behind liberal democracy, in my mind. All right. And they see war as the only way to dig them out of this recession that we're going to we are in right now, just like the way World War I had dug them out of the First Depression, and then World War II, where US had Germany just flourishes. And part of the unmasking of the system is just the lawlessness of the Supreme Court at this point. So what I'm just saying is that while we plan, and I'm not against, and I'm really thoroughly and 20% for what we're doing and continue to do. I just don't think that we realize how deeply, what kind of deep trouble they are in at this point, and how they will fight back really fiercely against anybody who's trying to turn the clock against them, because they are in an existential crisis. That's kind of just what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Yeah, right. Thank you. Thank you, Kim. Okay, next up is Eduardo Cohen.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Two things. One, I'm in a large organization, and our experiences right now, it's been really split incredibly to the point where it can barely make a coherent statement on where Russia's involved. I'm wondering if other organizations are having internal splits. I think there's one small Marxist group that is in a lot of organizations that viscerally hates Russia and has made it very difficult to make clear, coherent statements against NATO and NATO's responsibility. I'm wondering how we can get around that to achieve more unity. And I also just like to say that I have been working against deconstruction propaganda since I came back from Vietnam a very long time ago, and I have never seen such a perfect propaganda storm. This is truly total spectrum dominance of the news media that's been unseen until this point.
Thank you, Eduardo. Joseph Pocky, what do you make of those comments?
So I guess I want to say a couple of things. Look, we are as a nation really crippled by the culture of empire, which is now well over a century old. And as William Appleman Williams wrote in his analysis of the Constitution, in many ways dates back to the vision of the founding fathers. And of course, add to that the military industrial complex. So, our struggle is how to work to create space and to transform, if you will, this culture that we're in. I want to take a little bit of issue. I think we need to acknowledge that what Russia did with its invasion was fundamentally wrong. It was a violation of the United Nations Charter. It was the invasion of a sovereign country. It has led to mass death. And I think we shouldn't, as a movement, be turning our heads away from that. And I think as a movement, we've developed a almost universal consensus that we seek a ceasefire, that we want negotiations that lead to a sovereign and neutral, non-nuclear Ukraine for the future. And I think a consensus is emerging that and I think a consensus is emerging that the future of the Donbass and Crimea should essentially be put on the shelf, that a negotiated settlement to end the war can leave that unresolved for some time to come. I think we also need to appreciate that the situation at the moment, and I don't like being a prophet of doom, but the situation is in many ways very analogous to the period leading up to World War I, except now we have nuclear weapons and climate change. That we're dealing with, if you will, competing capitalist powers. Russia is a capitalist state, a kleptomaniac capitalist state, a petro capitalist state. China is its own unique capitalist state. Chinese socialism with Chinese characteristics, but many of those characteristics are deeply capitalistic. There's a battle for resources, for markets, and our vision has to be, and I think consistent with advocacy for, if you will, survival through climate stability, has to be for a common security order that addresses the needs of humanity.
Thanks, Joseph. I just add this, that one of the things we talked about at the end of the conference was to think out of the box. And I think this is exactly what's demanded of us right now. We know history, and some of us know some of it better than others. And some of us know our history than we should, or not as well as we should. But I think the other thing is that notion that, remember, the opposite of war is in peace, it's creativity. And that's the invitation to each and every one of us in our groups, in our organizations, whether it's our local organizations or our international connections, to look at how we can creatively look at ourselves in the 21st century. You just noted these two important differences, Joseph. The nuclear weapons we have and the environmental degradation. If that doesn't scare the hell out of everybody, and I don't mean fear, because that's what immobilizes us, but the realization that we have more power than we know, and how do we connect with one another to operationalize that? That's the challenge. And every one of the ideas that people have brought up in this conversation is useful, because it's all a part of the whole, that there's not one way to do it, that however you are, wherever you are, we can make those differences and create that world, but we need to be encouraged and keep creating communities of resistance to do it.
Thank you, Paki. Well said. Well, I'd like to thank everyone for coming tonight. I'd like to thank our panelists, Paki, Joseph, and Anne, for their remarks, and also those who voiced their comments and questions and enabled us to enrich the conversation. We're up against the struggle of our lifetimes, but let's not lose hope. Don't forget to contact Congress. We did finally get up to 95 people who had submitted the action to your senators and representatives. You can also contact them in other ways. You can call them. They do have to vote on the National Defense Authorization Act, possibly next week, or if not, the week after in the House, which does contain the U.S. military budget. And as you know, that budget has greatly increased from past years. It's been increasing year by year. Now it's increasing more steeply than ever. And certainly in Massachusetts, we will be reaching out about the Ukraine war. We're going to be out on the streets on Tuesday with flyers and petitions, and other days throughout July. And I'm sure that activists in other states the same. MAPA's next webinar is on Monday night, Observations from Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria, a report back by Jeff Klein. He is our board member and has spent a month in the Middle East touring those countries, and he's got a lot to share with us. So I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you for coming, everyone, tonight. And I will be following up with an email with a link to the video that you can then share with others. Thank you so much for joining us. Good night.